In the 1990s, David worked at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and it's with that experience that his essay opens, his essay Seeing Truganini. It opens with reflections on a disturbing photograph, and we might come back to talk about that photograph a bit later. David then goes on to advance some forthright views about the display, reproduction and sale of contested historical artworks, in particular the plaster busts of Tasmanian Aboriginal leaders Truganini and Wiradjuri, busts that were made in Hobart in 1835-36 by the colonial settler and artist Benjamin Law. I think he was a jeweller, in fact. When these busts were offered for sale by Sotheby's last year, the auction was subject to protest by a delegation from the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, and eventually they were withdrawn from sale. And David, who was working at Sotheby's at the time, writes in his essay, Seeing Truganini, that, well, he defends the sale, the right to sell those objects, and he objects to the argument that these busts shouldn't be displayed, saying it amounts to censorship of secular images and is plain silly, David's words. That's only one strand of his argument, though, and so I'd like to begin by asking David to summarise the key arguments, key elements of his essay. David.
Seeing Truganini is just me, as a curator, as a writer, as an Australian, as a citizen, talking to myself, or to the essay's unknown absent friend, trying to clarify things that I have found difficult or disturbing. It's not a manifesto, it's not a letter of demand, but it does object, it does question, it does challenge. It objects to an academic and museological culture which is so habituated to political correctness, so constrained by the influence of government, the media and special interests, that it often fails in its responsibility properly and fully to investigate and interpret the past. It questions the exclusive right of Aboriginal Australians to be the final arbiters on all matters of Aboriginal material culture, even when that cultural material contains significant elements of non-Aboriginal influence or manufacture or context or history, even where non-Aboriginal Australians may have more or better quality data. It challenges us as museum professionals and museum audiences, as non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australians, to try and reach towards an agreement on historical truths, or if this is not entirely possible, then at least to achieve some sort of courtesy and accommodation in the intercultural discourse. It challenges historians to maintain their discipline's methodological rigour while presenting more nuanced, more personal, more imaginative readings of our several pasts, the sort of writing to be found in the work of Inga Clendinnen, Greg Denning, Robert Kenny or James Boyce. What Seeing Truganini really boils down to is one large and difficult question, or rather set of questions. How do we deal with unsettling images and artefacts and the uncomfortable historical truths of which they are evidence? How should the artefacts of colonialism and culture clash be shown? How should they be discussed? We need to think carefully about this stuff, because time passes and things change. New information becomes available and the boundaries of knowledge shift. Two examples. When I was at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery in the 1990s, the mariners' shell necklaces were regarded as a primary expression of traditional Palawa culture. The examples held in public museums and private collections were greatly valued, and the collecting, burnishing and stringing of mariners by contemporary Aboriginal Tasmanians was seen as a significant reclamation of cultural heritage. But that was before the ratbag Vandemonian researcher Ray Norman found the account of a 1908 trial in which a Hobart wharf labourer was charged with the theft from a ship of 100 dozen shell necklaces. A bit more digging and he uncovered a not insubstantial early 20th century manufacturing, retailing and exporting industry. Branch offices in Honolulu, no less. Suddenly, the mariner takes on a strong intercultural dimension, and its authenticity becomes ambiguity. The second thing, when I wrote Seeing Truganini, this is more recent, I declared that, and I quote myself, "Law's only other known bust of George Augustus Robinson has been lost." Since the publication of the essay, Gareth Knapman at the Museum of Victoria and Olga Zara at the State Library of Victoria have found the missing sculpture by trawling old registers and the library's collection store. If some sections of the Aboriginal community find the display of Truganini and Wiradjuri busts inappropriate or offensive, what will they make of the conciliator himself, draped in his Roman toga? So what I'd like to talk about tonight are the questions: what can be seen, what should be seen, by whom, by whose authority, and under what conditions?
Why should it just be Indigenous people who are the arbiters of what is allowed to be on display? My response to that would be, who actually owns Indigenous culture? And things, as you've pointed out, aren't static. Things do change. I would ask, what special interests, what do you define as special interests? What special interests are we talking about? And I say that from my position when I was at the National Gallery of Australia and watching what was happening across that muddy pond, Lake Burley Griffin, over at the National Museum, with the history wars, the culture wars, and the discussions that were going on about what was allowed to be on display, what text could go up, who was allowed to veto what you should be doing and what you should be saying. And I think it is incredibly loaded, but I do think I don't think there's one way of approaching this, and I don't. It's not react, but I strongly respond to the idea that there's too much political correctness in terms of what is put on display and who has the say of what is out there. And one of the things that I picked up on with the essay was that you felt frustrated that there was very little public response from any curators within institutions, anyone kind of speaking out. And I took that possibly, I mean, I stepped back from it when I was watching what was happening. I was interested to see what was happening because I've been watching with auction houses and particularly with Indigenous art on the secondary market. There was a lot of discussion that was going on behind the scenes, and perhaps it's not simply that everything has to be put into that kind of public arena. I think also perhaps I felt that you were being a little bit disingenuous because you were involved with Sotheby's, so it becomes, and I know that it was your essay was a rumination. It was kind of a, a discussion with yourself, and like, why didn't I stand up and put my ideas forward more strongly? But I think there was a few conflicting areas there for me, and I've talked with Julie about this. I'd actually been talking about the busts because I'd been doing some research with Indigenous colleagues around the country to see what busts were in which collections. This is way before all of this happened, because I just remember back being an art school student in the mid-1980s and going to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and the Aboriginal collection then was in the basement there, and you had to go through the colonial galleries to get to it, and down these stairs, and everything was kind of dark brown and Hessian and, as Richard Bell would say, very ooga booga, and you had poor old Melanesian material sort of jammed up the back, and it was kind of a weird adventure, and it reminded me of your statement from when you were a young boy going to the museum and the things that you're drawn to because they're kind of scary. You're not quite sure how you relate to them. But I'll never forget that there was a bust of Truganini and a bust of Wiradjuri at the top of those stairs, and it was really, really important for me as a young Aboriginal kid living in Sydney, trying to find my way at art school, that I went past those people who I saw as guardians of what was down there. But they are incredibly loaded because they are like trophies of empire. They are, regardless of what they were, when they were created and why they were created, they are really loaded objects. And I later, 10 years later, when I was at the Art Gallery of Western Australia, and the poor old plaster busts that they're in their collection was sort of stored really, ignominiously in one of the collection stores there, and I used to feel great sorrow every time I went past them, and it was like I would talk with the director, how can we address these objects, what do we do? So I don't think for me there hasn't been a clear-cut thing. I mean, that's a bit of a sort of rumination on that as well.
But the story with Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery and the Tasmanian Aboriginal community go way back beyond that. It goes back to when William Lanny died in 1869, I think it was, when a member of the Royal Society, Dr. William Crowther, and another fellow, George Stokel, fought over Lanny's body, who at the time was considered to be the last Tasmanian Aboriginal male in existence. So they fought over him. They mutilated his body. They cut him up into pieces. Truganini felt the same thing would happen to her. So on her deathbed, she cried out to be hidden, to be buried in the mountains, but instead she was buried up at the women's prison in South Hobart. 2 years later, the Royal Society had her body exhumed, and a few years later, and David alludes to that in his book, in his essay, about her being on display from 1904 to 1947. It was due to public outcry that it was actually taken down and put in storage until 1976, when she was handed back to the community and cremated, almost 100 years after her death. It's issues like this, and the Tasmanian Aboriginal community have got a really, really long memory when it comes to situations like this. But as I said, it's a bigger picture, and it's not just about the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, it's not just about communities on the mainland, it's about the impact that we can have in relation to the stories we tell. Well, I'll just tell you a little bit about the picture. It's a photograph of a very, very old Tasmanian Aboriginal display. It has baskets, shell necklaces, stone tools, model bark canoes, and Truganini skeleton on display. I suppose David's problem was not being able to have the courage to even be able to broach the subject, I suppose. At the time, there was nobody there. There were no Aboriginal curators at the TMAG until I came along in 1997. And up until that time, there hadn't been any Aboriginal curators. As far as I'm aware, I was the first one. But from that point on, from when I first started, regardless of what David would have wanted to do, in showing the image in any form whatsoever, it's something that he would never have been able to do anyway, get permission to do, because like other people, like other communities, like yourself, I suppose, how would you feel about having your mother's skeleton or your grandfather's skeleton on public display? You wouldn't like it at all. So the Tasmanian Aboriginal community would not like the image to be shown in any way whatsoever. It all comes down to showing images, people wanting to use images. Where do you draw the line? Do you keep saying yes to people, or does there come a point in time where you say, no, this is enough, enough's enough? We've been through so much that I think we should just be left alone to deal with our own issues, rather than everybody else trying to have a little piece of us. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, let's talk about the picture. I'll just remind you, this is a photograph of the display that Tony described from 1947. So it's a photograph of a display about the extinct Tasmanian Aborigines, and it features Truganini's skeleton. This was a display until 1947 in the museum. Now, that photograph, David confronted early on in his career at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and it worries him still that he didn't know what to do with it. I think I can say it that way. He wasn't sure how, because and I'll make this point and get David to respond and the others to respond. In fact, we need to know about that photograph. We need to not forget what was done to Truganini.
But you also have to take in hand, and you have to have respect from the community who are the descendants of that person. I mean, it's different in different areas. When I was dealing with an exhibition of Michael Riley, who was a Wiradjuri Gamaroi filmmaker and photographer from New South Wales, and there were photographs, and he died, and there were photographs of Michael. So there was long kind of discussions with members of his family, and one of his cousins said, which was really interesting for me, she said, you know, we're not like the mob from the top end in that we love to look at our photos of our people who've gone because this is all we've got. And so you do have to play it by ear depending where you are and who you're dealing with. And, you know, that if a community makes that decision, I think you have to abide by that. I mean, that's regardless of whether an image is out in the public domain. And it seems to me that it's something that you still have to kind of search for, whether it is on, I don't know, websites or whatever. You have to take into account if that's the decision of that community.
Is there a difference between a photographic image like that and a painting, or a bust, as in this case a plaster bust? Because there's an awful lot of paintings.
Oh, I think there's a big difference with paintings. I mean, I can't imagine, you know, that all the Glovers and the Von Gerards and the whatevers would...
But then what's the distinction then between that and the busts?
This is a representation of the physical, and you jump in here, Tony, because the physical remains of somebody, and if a particular community says we don't want that out there, we don't want to be seeing it. I mean, like I think you had a good suggestion. Is like, let's look at a recreation without that. You know, why don't you have a label there if that's what you're looking at? You know, if that was a suggestion for what you were doing. You know, it's you have to be mindful of those images and it isn't just political correctness. It's not just a blanket thing that happens, I don't think.
Well, if I hope I was advocating that kind of specific attention. Now,
it seemed to me you were worried about history not being acknowledged, it being...
I'm worried about it because that's my training as a curator, to read what is in the objects or what surrounds the objects and read those inferentially, inductively, in the way in which our discipline works, is to find all the information that's associated with the object, tell its story, or read the story that the object tells, and I think the suppression of those stories is a suppression of national heritage, not just Aboriginal but non-Aboriginal heritage as well. And I don't think that...
How is it being suppressed though?
Well, because the story, because the picture. Let's just stick with the picture for the moment.
The photograph of the
case. Yeah. The photograph of the case, and it's a pretty confronting shot. But it's confronting because of its cultural specificity, because of its particular meaning to the Aboriginal community in Tasmania, because of its specific history in relation to the Tasmanian Museum and to the people of Tasmania and to the ideas that it's generated amongst the Tasmanians. One of the places where it escaped to, and where I found it to my surprise and shock on the web, was a Danish website, because when the Danish prince married his Tasmanian princess, the Danes all fell in love with Tasmania and looked up everything, and there were Truganini exhibitions all over Denmark, and stuff all over the web. So things get out, whether you control them, whether you can control them or not. So if, as a curator, I, out of respect for the feelings of the Indigenous community, am saying, no, we can't possibly show that image, we can't reproduce it in our publications, or we can't put it on public display, I'm denying people access to the expertise that resides within the institution, to the information that might make sense of that picture that is floating around out there in cyberspace.
Tony?
I think, David, if the opportunity arose and that you were allowed to, through TMAG, to have been able to do something with that image. I guess they would have well and truly shot themselves in the foot after, the battles that they've actually had in trying to repatriate Truganini's remains back to the community. But it goes a lot further. It's not just about TMAG, and it's not about David writing his article. It's not just about, as I said earlier, about the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. This is a woman we're actually talking about. A woman who'd seen quite a lot in her life. It started from a very, very early age. She grew up on Bruny Island. She'd seen her mother killed. She'd been raped numerous times. She'd seen her partner-to-be, husband-to-be, killed right in front of her. What more harrowing experience could somebody like that go through? But it got worse as she got older. She was subject to so many different things in her lifetime that, we as a people today sitting here would not have the guts or the balls to be able, or even the energy to be able to go through what she actually went through. So I think we should just not concentrate and worry too much about Truganini, because, as I said, she's like us. She was a woman. She lived and breathed, and she enjoyed life. And the things that the white people actually did to her, would make anybody, just want to crawl under a rock and stay there forever. But she didn't.
See, I think the thing, it's like she was so stripped of dignity.
Exactly.
And that photo reinforces that. We know that photo exists. I think there's much more power in looking at the photos of her when she was alive. And it's not just that I didn't read that she can look after herself. Those photos of her towards the end of her life, I saw that she knew exactly what was going to happen to her. And even though it's 100+ years down the track, why do we have to put that image back out in the public domain? We can write about it and we can talk about it, and people can pick that up from your writing, that you felt incredibly disturbed by looking at that. But just because it was out there, it's what was in it. It's the fact that it's her skeleton.
In a way, and I'll get Tony and David to respond to this too, perhaps the way to deal with the photograph is its very absence. To talk about it, as you've done in writing, David, as a way of, but not to show it. And that can inform whatever versions of it are out there on the internet that you can't control. It is in a book somewhere that someone's photocopied. It doesn't need to be shown. The painting by Robert Dowling, colonial artist, called Tasmanian Aborigines, and there is a group of Tasmanian Aborigines visible in this painting, and almost all of the people in that painting are individually identifiable. We know who they are historically. But David, when it was displayed, I think at the NGV,
it was shown not with the names of the sitters identified, not with any background in relation to Tasmanian Aboriginals, but with an extended passage of text from Edward Said, which explained...
what year was that they did that?
It was when they reopened at Fed Square.
That'd be 2000.
Yeah.
More recent even than that, I think. But
it was up for a while. So it was the first display, I think, in Fed Square, in the Australian galleries there. Right. So it was theory. It was post-colonial theory was what you got on the wall. You didn't get the historical truths, and I would advocate always the presentation of the empirical truths, the historical truths, because there's nothing to be afraid of, because whatever the truth is, if it's an historical truth, it's there and it's finished. Processes of the negotiation of a place within Australian community of Indigenous communities, that goes on, that continues. But the past sits there, just waiting for you to go and uncover it. And that's the joy of it. That's the joy of being an historian, is that you can go back and you can read. And as you read the past, if you don't have the truth about the past, you can't get the truth. If you don't have the truth, you can't get the reconciliation.
But what version of the truth is out there? And we've seen so many different versions, and I can see it now when I go into the Australian Museum now, and I look at the labels to see what's there, and you look for the gaps. You look at what is missing, and that's why it is really important for, and it is I don't know if they're equally shared histories, but I've certainly worked with non-Indigenous curatorial colleagues on aspects of collections because they do inform each other. But what I gain strongly from elements of your essay is it's a very kind of Eurocentric stance, and this, why can't I? Why can't I have access to that? And sometimes you just can't, and you have to accept, based on whatever the situation is. It's not a blanket thing. I think it's too easy to say, oh, there's so much, political correctness, and we've all leant too far to the left, and etc. And I think that's, just an obtuse kind of way of reading it. Everything has to be. Things are read on the merit of what's happening with those things, and if the community doesn't want that that photograph to continue this raping of this person's their spirit, then that has to be accepted, regardless of whether that image exists or not.
So, are you advocating the destruction of?
No, I'm not. I'm not advocating the destruction of it.
So, what do you do? What do you do? I mean, that's the question that I asked.
What you were saying is, I thought that was a very good point that you put forward. Is that it is the absence of it. If you have the absence of it, that makes people discuss why it's important to take those things into account. I think if something is not there.
So, for you, it's a question of creativity and curatorial practice.
No, I think it's a question of dealing with each object as it is, and it's also discussing with, if you've got the chance to discuss with...
Which is precisely the broader implication, I think, of what I was arguing, if I was arguing anything in the essay, was that you won't get good policy. You won't get good health policy, you won't get good education policy, you won't get good Aboriginal policy applicable to remote communities in the Northern Territory unless you deal with each of those communities on its own merits, in its own context, in the particularities of its situation.
Yes.
And I think that
one size doesn't fit all.
One size does not fit all. Exactly. You can't. There is no autonomous Aboriginal subject. Some sort of generalised, totalised Aboriginality.
There isn't. But you've bought into that in your statement, in your essay, by stating that we're leaning to, we're going with left-wing fringe elements. I mean,
no, I never used those sorts of terms.
I was lying in bed reading it.
What I said was, if you self-censor, you lay yourself open to the culture warriors of the right. Do you want the discourse to be dominated by Keith Windshuttle and
Christopher
Quadrant?
Pearson?
Yeah.
I think again that's being disingenuous. I think this is a really clear-cut case of what you do, what you need to do, and I think it comes down to the idea of how important you see yourself within an institution. One of the things that was put onto me at the National Gallery, we were constantly being told to work out what you can de-accession, go through the collection and work out what you can get rid of. We haven't got enough room. And I said, I'm not going to do that, because that's, the history that's there by previous curators, whether I'm going to put all those works on display, which I won't. I think there were works there that were bought from a particular period or time, but it wasn't up to me to kind of decide and
change history.
I'm not going to censor those things, but I think there is very much a capacity to have discussion rather than take this kind of viewpoint that this is here and it's part of what this institution is, and I want it to be put out there irrespective of how that's going to impact on, in this case, a community that's already been incredibly wounded.
One of the things about that picture is the fact that it's got a skeleton in it, and that gives it a particular potency. But it's not the skeleton. You can get a visceral reaction from that image, but it's a visceral reaction that comes from your frontal lobe because you know the story. If you know the story, if it's just a skeleton, it's just a skeleton. There are skeletons in medical museums. There are skeletons in Italian churches underneath altarpieces that are fine, not a problem. There are skeletons in mummy cases that people don't appear to have any trouble with. So there are relativities all over the place. I mean, the difficult imagery, images from the Shoah, the concentration camp images are equally potent and distressing. But you cannot suppress those truths and those visual evidences if you're going to have understandings down through the generations.
I guess the question there is whether not showing the image is the same as suppressing, not showing the visual image is the same as suppressing the historical truth. Are those two necessarily part of the same thing?
The Indigenous people of this country as the exception. The rest of the nation is an immigrant nation, and an immigrant nation from all over the place. And the stories that are particular to the Aboriginal community, that are particular to the original Australians, are now, whether intentionally or not, they're now the possession of all Australians. They're now the responsibility of all Australians.
See, even the terminology I find really telling.
Sorry about the word possession. Yeah, I corrected myself. They're the responsibility of all Australians. When William Lanny died, there were 4 pallbearers at his funeral. One was a white ship's captain, one was an African American, one was a man from Kangaroo Island who may or may not have been Palawa, and the other was the dark-skinned man, a Hawaiian. So there was a multicultural component there, and this is a multicultural society that we live in, and if we're going to make it work as a multicultural society, we need to be respectful of the original ownership culture, but also of the position of those people who are outside of that culture, who may require introduction.
Just a comment with what David just said about the pallbearers at William Lanny's funeral. I suppose at the time, he died in 1869, there would have been a handful of people. They would have been very old women who wouldn't have had the energy to be able to do anything. And William Lanny was considered at the time to be the last Tasmanian Aboriginal male. So where in the bloody hell are we going to get Aboriginal males from to be able to act as pallbearers? So these people, no doubt, would have been colleagues and shipmates of William Lanny. So who better to do it than if he hasn't got his own people to do it?
Well, that's the point, isn't it? You know,
because they'd all been killed off.
There's 2 points. You can read that story as a tragic story of the death of Aboriginals, or you can read it as a positive story about a man's mates. And we have to make those choices every day.
Well, it's both those stories, obviously.
Starting to sound like a politician.